shortly after Trump came into office, as the mainstream media became sort of explicitly biased. So did Wikipedia.
In this episode, I sit down with Larry Sanger, co-founder of Wikipedia and now president of the Knowledge Standards Foundation. He discusses how Wikipedia uses essentially a blacklist.
And according to this list, you simply may not cite, may not use as sources of Wikipedia articles anything that has been branded as right-wing.
How is it that we do not know the identities of many of Wikipedia's top editors?
85% of them are anonymous. You don't know how many accounts are controlled by a single individual or a single organization that pretends to be essentially organic, but it's not.
Can and should Congress do something about it?
Congress is investigating now. The Oversight Committee is investigating foreign influence on Wikipedia. We need to understand what the hell is going on behind the scenes better.
Could Elon Musk's Grokpedia offer a more balanced alternative?
I might be very pleasantly surprised that it actually is neutral. But we'll see.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kellick. Larry Sanger, so good to have you back on American Thought Leaders.
It's good to be back.
I've been following Wikipedia for a long time, longer than 20 years, in fact, which is when I really started with the Epoch Times. And I've watched our entry at the Epoch Times change dramatically over those years. At the beginning, it was quite reasonable and thoughtful and I thought well edited. And I was a big backer, frankly, of Wikipedia. I loved the idea, right? But then, especially as we started to grow, especially as we started to become more influential, I mean, the term pack of lies comes to mind. It just turned into this gross distortion, and it creates this huge problem for us, which is when, potential readers, find out about the Epoch Times, they'll go to Wikipedia and they'll read this terrible distortion of reality and might not actually, subscribe, when normally if they just, didn't have that problem, let's say, it would be something perfectly reasonable for them to look at. So I want to get at, I don't want to focus on the Epoch Times specifically, but I suspect it's not just us, okay? But what happened?
It's definitely not just you. I've talked to a half a dozen other media sources over the last couple of weeks, and most of them have complaints of your sort. I'm an advisor of BitChute, the video platform, and they have complaints. Any sort of media platform or public figure, for that matter, that has a reputation that affects their reach and influence in the world is going to be basically bad-mouthed by Wikipedia pretty, predictably, I would say. So why? That's a good question. There's a lot of different reasons why. What I've always said is that Wikipedia is one of the institutions that the left marched through. We talk about the march through the institutions, and I think that definitely happened. It was already happening in 2001, in the first year. But I think another more perhaps illuminating and timely aspect of the question is, well, isn't there something big that has happened since Trump came into office the first time? The answer is the mainstream media in general, and I lump Wikipedia in with it, really kind of went off the deep end. It took what was originally just the Fox News format and then the MSNBC format, and that was adopted by everyone, and as a result, Wikipedia just aped that. And because in those new formats, journalists' pretensions of objectivity are out the window, that essentially is what happened with Wikipedia as well. Wikipedia's neutrality policy says, or at least used to say, that on issues of controversy, it should be impossible to tell what position the authors of the article take. That's no longer the case in practice for sure, and the policy page called Neutral Point of View has been in subtle ways rewritten so that it forbids what's called false balance, which just means basically it's required now, even for the sake of neutrality, that they take a side when one side is clearly wrong, in somebody's opinion.
That doesn't sound like neutrality.
No.
It's sort of it's like an inversion of the word, in fact, what you're just describing, right?
It is.
So you described the march through the institutions, but when did you mentioned back in 2001 you were already seeing some kind of issue, but when did this all really become a problem? Because, I mean, there's some pages on Wikipedia that I've seen within the last couple of years. I really don't go there that often anymore because of this exact issue. But there's some pages I remember, at least a couple of years ago, which were pretty neutral, but they were pages that were of no particular political import from the perspective of the GAS people, as you describe them, right? Globalist, academic, secular, progressive. This is what you describe as the viewpoint of Wikipedia today. If it doesn't have to do with that very much, or it's not particularly influential, it might be neutral, might be left alone. But anything that does have a political import from these perspectives now is would you say that's accurate?
For sure.
And quickly back to my question, when did you really start to see this shift from neutrality into something much more politicized? When was it that became a big issue for you?
To be quite honest, I was noticing shifts practically from the beginning. It didn't become really obvious to everyone until I think maybe the last 5 years. But I was noticing Wikipedia taking definite stands, for example, on global warming. I thought that was surprising and not in keeping with the neutrality policy, as early as, I think, 2005, 2006, where it was taking what was at that time called a scientific point of view. I'm not saying the scientific point of view is bad. I think it's good. It's just that it's not neutral. And what is mainstream science may not actually be the truth as the history of science shows. That is one of the main reasons why a good encyclopedia will canvass all of the different views on a subject. Now, I said back in 2010, 2012, that the sort of bias that Wikipedia shows is very similar to that of the New York Times or the BBC, very sort of establishment center-left. But I noticed shortly after Trump came into office that, again, as the mainstream media became sort of explicitly biased, so did Wikipedia. And it became, if anything, worse, perhaps especially after January 6th. So I ended up writing a series of blog posts about Wikipedia's bias, which I was surprised that it did this, actually. So 3 blog posts in 2020, 2021, and I think 2023, in which I basically gave a lot of examples. And apparently this was news to people. I was surprised that it was news. I thought everybody knew this. And even now, people are still sort of waking up to the reality that Wikipedia does, on many pages, not all of them, but on many pages, act as essentially propaganda.
You know, in a very similar way, it's very interesting. So, I mean, basically, you lump Wikipedia in with legacy news sources that have this whatever perspective the legacy news sources have, which is often a very similar perspective across a whole range of issues. Wikipedia just fits neatly in there, and maybe in a more extreme way. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, well, it reflects those sources because basically by policy on Wikipedia, editors are supposed to cite secondary sources, what they call secondary sources. So not books, not tweets, but summations thereof in especially the news media. And Wikipedia now has a page, a list of what they call perennial sources, and it functions as a blacklist. And according to this list, you simply may not cite, may not use as sources of Wikipedia articles anything that has been branded as right-wing. So I don't think that the Epoch Times, for example, is particularly right-wing, but it is colored red on this list. So there's a color coding of different media sources. The New York Times, of course, is green, which means you can cite the New York Times. In fact, you don't even have to say that the source is from New York Times in the text of the article. You can just speak in Wikipedia's own voice and then use the New York Times as a footnote.
As if it were a fact.
As if it were a fact.
Mm-hmm.
And
that is deeply disturbing. But yes, please continue.
Yeah. Right. Anything that is colored yellow, which means essentially caution, and red, which means it's a no-go. You may not cite this for any purposes except perhaps characterizing facts about the source. Those things, if you actually attempt to use such sources, that actually might be grounds for your being dismissed from the project. That's how strongly they feel about it.
And just explain to me a little bit what you mean about this march through the institutions.
As I recall, one of the left-wing theorists explicitly stated as a goal that we, those on the left, attempting to effect revolutionary change, need to execute a march through the institutions. It's Marx, if I'm not mistaken. And essentially capture education, government, of course, but especially education, the media, the churches, and so forth. So each of these institutions has been, to a greater or lesser extent, been systematically, carefully, strategically infiltrated by the left. And, well, Wikipedia is one of those, insofar as Wikipedia sort of represents what we are all expected to believe, at least from an establishment point of view. It is one of the controlling, I guess you could say, one of the controlling institutions of modern civilization. I'm sorry to say.
Larry, we're going to be right back after a short break. And we're back with Larry Sanger, co-founder of Wikipedia and now president of the Knowledge Standards Foundation. So in the past when we spoke, it seemed to me like you believed that Wikipedia cannot be reformed. But now you have come up with 9 theses, which you nailing to the virtual door of Wikipedia, I suppose, suggests to me that you think it might still be reformed. Tell me about that.
I think it's possible. I think that the reform would not come from the people who like the system, obviously. It would require an influx of people who agree with the theses. But that's possible, thousands of people who hear about this, especially as part of this campaign that I have started, might actually descend upon Wikipedia and, get some cred in the Wikipedia system. They have every right to do so. It is an open project. It is not limited to the left in any way, shape, or form. And in addition, of course, the supposed adults in the room, the board of trustees of the Wikimedia Foundation, they have certain obligations, I think, that they can execute and impose their high-level decisions on the Wikipedia community. For example, they could declare that there will be an editorial constitutional convention. Wikipedia should convene an editorial assembly which actually formalizes the adoption of rules instead of doing what they have done, which is very anarchical and not entirely legitimate, according to many observers.
And not as transparent, I think. That's also what you're saying, right?
Well, because the participants in Wikipedia are mostly anonymous. You don't know how many accounts are controlled by a single individual or a single organization that pretends to be essentially organic, but it's not. I think there's a lot of astroturfing going on Wikipedia. A lot of money that is being plowed into it through PR firms especially. And
but it's hard to even assess that, because aside from the outcomes,
if you want any chance of reforming Wikipedia, then it's absolutely necessary to have some sort of body that has been legitimized, that can actually meet face to face and debate on behalf of the participants in Wikipedia. Obviously, the people on Wikipedia can continue to debate in their usual way, but again, it's sort of a black box what's really going on, because there's a lot of stuff that's being organized behind the scenes. It is not all transparent, but a face-to-face assembly would have a kind of legitimacy that the current proceedings do not, and would also make it possible then for more ambitious sorts of reforms, needed reforms that simply could not be made under the current ways of proceeding.
So transparency is central.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this has been a kind of a theme of the last however many years, that with the lack of transparency around decision-making, rationale, a lot of bad things can happen. A lot of bad policy can be instituted.
Right.
One of the things that I think your second thesis is to enable competing articles, and that I like that. That's a great one, right? Because at least you can have another perspective, and which hopefully would be as easily findable, because that's the other part, right? It's one thing if one article is shown as the be-all and end-all, and then there's a little tiny footnote with a second competing article. But if you that would actually be something that would be quite helpful in itself.
Right. People can look on larrysanger.org. There's a link to the 9 theses there. So we're talking about thesis number 2, enable competing articles. And there's a long essay to go with each of these. So the idea is that articles anyone could start an article on a topic that already has an article. It'd be a competing article, but it wouldn't immediately go live. It would be in a draft namespace, which many different people could look at. Articles would be moved to the main namespace when they meet objective criteria. Perhaps, as I explain in another of the theses, number 7, they would be promoted when they are rated in a certain way, whether by AI or by public rating or some other objective things like number of edits and number of contributors and things like that. And then the idea is the author would determine who works on the article. Generally speaking, we might encourage people to allow anyone who wants to, except perhaps people from a list that that the original article starter would want left off because they were causing problems. And essentially, if you want an article to be truly competitive, if it's just another completely open article, then that new article could be squatted on by the same old people, if you see what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. The idea is that each article would be started with its own framework. So right now, as we were saying before, Wikipedia has what I describe as a GASP framework. This isn't necessarily bad. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying that it is a framework. So globalist, academic, that's fine, secular, and progressive. And the combination of these things marks out Wikipedia's operative editorial framework as being very narrow, essentially the narrow approach of Western elitists, essentially, and leaving everybody else out. So there are many other frameworks that one could work within, like just an unbiased American political framework would openly invite both Republicans and Democrats to work together, explicitly stating that it's possible to use sources from what are characterized as the far right and the far left. Maybe not the absolutely insane ones, but right, we'll have some standards. And the Overton window would be opened deliberately pretty wide. And that's an example of a framework. You state that out front and you say, if you want to contribute to the article, then you're going to follow these basic ground rules. Wikipedia could do this. This is the proposal. I think it's not likely that they will, but they could.
Well, Larry Sanger, it's such a pleasure to have had you on again.
Well, thank you. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Jan.
Thank you all for joining Larry Sanger and me on this episode of American Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Jan Jekielek.
The Wikimedia Foundation did not immediately respond to our request for comment.